The year was 1885. Distant church bells rang across the rolling hills of Colorado's mining country as a stagecoach rattled along the dusty road towards Silver Creek. Inside, Abigail Foster clutched a worn leather satchel on her lap, her gloved fingers nervously tracing the brass clasp that secured her most precious possessions. A legal document, her late aunt's silver locket, and a letter from Mason Blackwood, the wealthiest mine owner in 3 counties. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter had arrived in Philadelphia 4 months earlier, shortly after her aunt's passing, had left Abigail with nothing but crushing debts and an uncertain future. Blackwood's proposition had been as unexpected as it was peculiar. Marriage. To a man she had never met, a partnership founded not on romance, but on mutual benefit. He would settle her considerable debts. She would bring her inheritance, controlling interest in a supposedly worthless plot of land adjacent to his most productive silver mine. But Abigail Foster harbored a secret that the distinguished Mr. Blackwood knew nothing about, one that she had carefully concealed beneath a grey muslin veil that now shielded her face from curious eyes. "Silver Creek Station!" the driver called, bringing Abigail's thoughts sharply back to the present. "End of the line, ma'am." Heart pounding beneath her high-necked travelling dress, Abigail gathered her meagre belongings. The small mining town sprawled before her, a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a church steeple rising above the chaotic arrangement of miners' shacks and businesses. It was nothing like the refined streets of Philadelphia, but if Mason Blackwood kept his word, it would soon be her home. Miss Foster, a tall man with silver-streaked hair and an immaculate suit, approached, his expression betraying neither warmth nor disdain. "I'm Walter Jenkins, Mr. Blackwood's attorney. He sent me to escort you to his residence." Abigail nodded, grateful that her veil concealed her expression. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. I appreciate the consideration." The attorney's gaze lingered momentarily on her veiled face before he gestured toward a waiting carriage. "Your trunks will follow. Mr. Blackwood is eager to conclude the arrangements as soon as possible." As the carriage climbed the winding road leading from town to the hillside where Mason Blackwood's mansion overlooked his domain, Abigail fought to steady her nerves. The agreement had seemed straightforward when proposed in writing. A marriage of convenience that would save her from destitution while giving Blackwood the land he coveted. Her aunt's will had been specific. The deed could not be sold, only transferred through marriage or direct inheritance, a peculiar stipulation that had brought Abigail to this remote corner of Colorado. Jenkins cleared his throat. "Miss Foster, I feel I should prepare you. Mr. Blackwood is a man of direct manner. He built his fortune through determination and shrewd business acumen, not social graces." "I'm not expecting a fairy tale, Mr. Jenkins," Abigail replied softly. "Only the fulfillment of a contract between practical parties." The attorney's expression softened slightly. "Nevertheless, I feel compelled to mention that Mr. Blackwood agreed to this arrangement sight unseen. Your personal appearance was not a factor in his decision." Abigail's hand moved instinctively to her veil. "Yes, I'm aware of what Mr. Blackwood expects, a homely spinster desperate enough to accept such terms." Jenkins had the decency to look uncomfortable. "The deed to your aunt's property is all that concerns him, Miss Foster." The carriage crested the hill, revealing a sprawling mansion of red stone and dark timber. Blackwood Manor, an imposing structure that seemed to declare its owner's status to the valley below. As they approached the circular drive, Abigail caught sight of a man standing on the wide porch, his broad shoulders and commanding posture suggesting he was accustomed to being obeyed without question. Mason Blackwood. He descended the steps as the carriage halted, his movements betraying impatience. Tall and powerfully built, with dark hair and a closely trimmed beard that framed a face more handsome than Abigail had anticipated, he looked every inch the mining baron who had conquered this wild territory through force of will. "Miss Foster," he said without preamble as Jenkins helped her from the carriage, "I trust your journey was acceptable." His voice was deep, with the faint trace of an accent she couldn't place, not quite southern, not quite eastern. His dark eyes assessed her critically, lingering on the veil that obscured her features. "It was adequate, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, meeting his gaze through the grey muslin. "Thank you for sending Mr. Jenkins to meet me." A practical courtesy. Blackwood gestured toward the house. "Come inside. The pastor is waiting. I see no reason to delay the formalities." Abigail's heart jumped. "Now? But I've only just arrived." "Is there a reason to wait, Miss Foster?" Blackwood's tone made it clear he considered the matter settled. "The terms were outlined in our correspondence. You bring your aunt's deed, I relieve your debts. Marriage is merely the legal mechanism to transfer the property, unless you've reconsidered." Jenkins shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Mason, perhaps Miss Foster would appreciate some time to refresh herself after her journey." Blackwood's expression hardened. "The Silverton Company representatives arrive tomorrow. I need the deed properly transferred before then." His gaze returned to Abigail. "Unless there's something you failed to disclose in our arrangement." Behind her veil, Abigail felt a flush of anger rise to her cheeks. This cold, calculating man saw her as nothing more than a means to acquire land, a homely, desperate spinster to be married and then conveniently forgotten once he had what he wanted. "No, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I simply expected the basic courtesy of being allowed to wash the dust of travel from my face before exchanging vows." Something flashed in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that the plain, desperate woman he'd corresponded with possessed a spine. "Very well. 1 hour. Jenkins will show you to your quarters." The room she was led to was spacious and well-appointed, if somewhat austere. A copper bathtub had been filled with steaming water, and a simple blue dress, not her own, had been laid across the bed. "Mr. Blackwood took the liberty of providing suitable attire," Jenkins explained. "Your trunks will arrive later." When Jenkins departed, Abigail sank onto the edge of the bed, her composure finally cracking. What had she gotten herself into? Mason. Blackwood was more intimidating in person than she had anticipated, colder, more calculating than his letters had suggested. Removing her gloves, Abigail caught sight of her reflection in the mirror across the room. Slowly, she rose and approached it, her fingers trembling as they reached for the pins securing her veil. The grey muslin fell away, revealing what she had hidden from curious eyes throughout her journey. Not the plain, scarred face that Mason Blackwood clearly expected, but features that had once caused a Philadelphia artist to beg to paint her portrait. High cheekbones, clear skin with a dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose, and large, expressive eyes the colour of amber. Abigail Foster was not homely. She was, by any conventional standard, beautiful. She had never corrected Blackwood's assumption about her appearance, an assumption clearly based on the fact that at 28 she remained unmarried and worked as a seamstress. In their correspondence, she had simply ignored his thinly veiled references to her presumed plainness. Let him believe what he wanted. Their arrangement was about practicality, not attraction. But as she unpinned her travel-mussed hair and prepared for the bath, Abigail wondered how Mason Blackwood would react when he discovered the truth. Would he be pleased to find himself married to a woman whose appearance would not embarrass him in society? Or would he be suspicious, questioning what other secrets she might be hiding? 1 hour later, dressed in the blue gown that fit her surprisingly well, Abigail descended the grand staircase. She had pinned her chestnut hair in a simple but elegant style and left the veil behind. Whatever Mason Blackwood's reaction to her true appearance might be, she would face it with dignity. She found him waiting in a book-lined study, his back to the door, as he examined papers spread across a massive oak desk. The elderly pastor sat nearby, looking uncomfortable in the oppressive silence. "Mr. Blackwood," she said clearly, "I'm ready." He turned, impatience written across his features, until his eyes met hers. Mason Blackwood froze, his expression shifting from irritation to shock to disbelief in rapid succession. The papers in his hands slipped, scattering across the polished floor. "Miss Foster?" His voice held none of the commanding certainty it had possessed an hour earlier. Abigail met his stunned gaze steadily. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood. Shall we proceed with the ceremony, or have you reconsidered our arrangement?" The pastor rose, clearly confused by the tension crackling between them. Mason's dark eyes hadn't left her face, his expression unreadable now that the initial shock had passed. "An explanation seems in order," he said finally, his voice low. "I don't believe so," Abigail replied with calculated calm. "Our agreement concerned a deed and financial obligations, not personal appearances. Unless my face changes the terms of our contract?" Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. Anger, suspicion, or perhaps a combination of both. For a moment, Abigail feared he might call off the whole arrangement, leaving her stranded in this remote town with no means to return east, and creditors eagerly awaiting her return. Then, to her surprise, Mason Blackwood laughed, a short, harsh sound utterly devoid of humor. "It seems we've both made assumptions, Miss Foster." He gestured for the pastor to approach. "You're right, our agreement stands. Let's proceed with the ceremony." As they exchanged mechanical vows in the fading afternoon light, Abigail couldn't help but wonder what other surprises awaited in this marriage of convenience, and what secrets Mason Blackwood might be concealing beneath his own carefully controlled exterior. The wedding reception, if it could be called that, consisted of a brief, silent meal in Blackwood's opulent dining room. Only Walter Jenkins remained as witness, his uncomfortable glances between bride and groom suggesting he sensed the tension simmering beneath the surface. "The deed," Mason said abruptly, setting down his barely touched glass of wine. "I believe now is the appropriate time to complete our transaction." Abigail dabbed her lips with a napkin. "Of course, I have it in my satchel." Jenkins cleared his throat. "Perhaps these matters could wait until morning. It is, after all, your wedding night." Mason's dark gaze flicked to the attorney. "This marriage is a business arrangement, Walter, nothing more." "Even so," Jenkins persisted, "there are properties to maintain." Abigail rose from the table. "It's quite all right, Mr. Jenkins. I harbor no romantic illusions about this union." She turned to Mason. "I'll fetch the document. Then perhaps you might show me to my quarters. It's been a rather exhausting day." Mason's jaw tightened at her calm assertion. Clearly he had expected a desperate, grateful woman, not this composed creature who met his demands with quiet dignity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the study, Abigail presented the deed, the document that had brought her to this remote mining town and into this strange marriage. Mason examined it with the intensity of a prospector assessing a gold nugget. "The Whispering Pines claim," he murmured, his finger tracing the property boundaries. "Your aunt held this land for 20 years without developing it." "Aunt Margaret was stubborn," Abigail replied. "She believed the land held value beyond what others could see." Mason's expression remained unreadable. "And what do you believe?" "Mrs. Blackwood?" The name startled her, a reminder that whatever the circumstances, they were now legally bound. "I believe my aunt was a shrewd woman," she answered carefully, "though I confess I know little about mining prospects." "Indeed. Mason folded the deed and locked it in his desk drawer. Jenkins will file the transfer paperwork tomorrow. He hesitated, studying her face with an intensity that made her skin warm. You deliberately concealed your appearance. It wasn't a question, but Abigail answered anyway. I never claimed to be plain, Mr. Blackwood. You simply assumed. An assumption you encouraged by hiding behind that veil. The veil was for privacy during travel, not deception, she countered. In our correspondence, you made it clear that my appearance was irrelevant to our arrangement. Was that untrue? Mason's eyes narrowed. I dislike surprises, Mrs. Blackwood. And you, it seems, are full of them. Before she could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them. A stern-faced housekeeper entered, her grey hair pulled into a severe bun. I've prepared the blue guest room for Mrs. Blackwood, she announced, her tone suggesting she found the situation highly irregular. Thank you, Mrs. Winters. Mason turned to Abigail. Mrs. Winters manages the household. She will show you to your quarters. My quarters. Abigail raised an eyebrow. Not our quarters? A muscle twitches in Mason's jaw. As you pointed out earlier, ours is a marriage of convenience. I see no reason to complicate matters with unnecessary intimacies. Abigail felt a curious mixture of relief and indignation. How pragmatic of you. I'm a practical man, Mrs. Blackwood. It's how I've built my fortune. He gestured toward the door. We'll discuss your role in this household tomorrow. For now, rest. The altitude affects newcomers. Following the dour Mrs. Winters through the mansion's shadowy corridors, Abigail took mental inventory of her situation. She was now legally married to one of the wealthiest men in Colorado Territory, a man who had married her solely for a piece of land and clearly harbored suspicions about her true motives. The blue room proved spacious and well-appointed, with windows overlooking the moonlit valley below. Silver Creek's lights twinkled in the distance, while closer to the house she could make out the dark structures of what must be the entrance to Mason's primary mine. Breakfast is at 7, Mrs. Winters informed her curtly. Mr. Blackwood rises at 5 and expects punctuality from the household. When the housekeeper departed, Abigail sank onto the edge of the bed. Her trunks had arrived, but she felt too exhausted to unpack. The events of the day swirled in her mind. The journey's end, the rushed wedding, Mason's stunned reaction to her unveiled face. What had she expected? That he would be pleased to discover his mail-order bride wasn't the plain spinster he anticipated, perhaps even grateful. Instead, he seemed almost angry, as though her beauty were an act of deliberate deception. Morning came too quickly. The unfamiliar mountain light streaming through windows she'd been too tired to properly curtain. Abigail dressed carefully in one of her better day dresses, a deep green that complemented her coloring. If she was to navigate this peculiar household, she would need every advantage, including the confidence that came from proper appearance. The dining room was empty when she arrived precisely at 7. A young maid appeared moments later with coffee. Mr. Blackwood left for the mine at dawn, ma'am, she explained, her curious eyes taking in Abigail's appearance. He said to tell you he'd return for a luncheon to discuss household matters. See? Abigail poured herself coffee. And Mrs. Winters? In the kitchen, ma'am. Would you like me to fetch her? No, thank you. Abigail considered her options. Instead, perhaps you might give me a tour of the house. I should familiarize myself. With my new home, the maid, Betsy, proved a valuable guide. As they moved through the mansion's rooms, she provided a running commentary that revealed far more than a mere description of furniture and architecture. Mr. Blackwood had this wing built 3 years ago, after the big strike made him properly rich, she explained. Before that, it was just the original cabin portion, what's now the kitchen and servants' quarters. How long have you worked here, Betsy? 2 years, ma'am. My pa works in the Silver Star mine. That's Mr. Blackwood's main operation. The household, Abigail discovered, consisted of Mrs. Winters, Betsy, a cook, 2 additional maids, a manservant, who attended to Mason's personal needs, and a groundskeeper. A substantial staff for a bachelor, or rather, for a man who had never intended to have a true marriage. "What about social engagements?" Abigail asked as they entered a rarely used formal parlour. "Does Mr. Blackwood entertain often?" Betsy looked surprised by the question. "Not really, ma'am. Sometimes business associates visit, or the bank manager. There's the annual Miners' Relief Fund dinner he hosts, but that's months away." Their tour ended at a locked door on the 2nd floor. "That's Mr. Blackwood's private study," Betsy explained. "Nobody goes in there except him, not even Mrs. Winters." Abigail's curiosity was piqued, but she merely nodded. "Thank you for the tour, Betsy. You've been most helpful." Left to her own devices, Abigail spent the remainder of the morning exploring the grounds. The gardens were well maintained but utilitarian, lacking the personal touches that might reflect the owner's tastes. Everything about Blackwood Manor suggested function over sentiment, a place built to demonstrate wealth and position rather than to provide comfort. As promised, Mason returned at noon. Abigail found him in the main study, once again bent over. Paperwork, his expressions severe in concentration. "Mrs. Blackwood," he acknowledged without looking up, "I trust you found everything satisfactory." "The house is impressive," she replied, taking a seat without waiting for invitation, "though it lacks a woman's touch." That caught his attention. He set down his pen, studying her with those penetrating dark eyes. "I didn't bring you here to redecorate, Mrs. Blackwood." "Why did you bring me here then?" Abigail challenged. "Now that you have the deed, what role do you envision for your wife?" Mason leaned back in his chair. "A limited one. Your presence provides certain social conveniences. A married man is perceived differently in business circles. Beyond that, I expect you to maintain the household accounts, supervise the staff, and handle any social obligations that might arise." "A glorified housekeeper, then." His expression hardened. "You agreed to this arrangement, Mrs. Blackwood. It saved you from financial ruin, as I recall." "I'm not complaining," Abigail clarified, "merely establishing expectations. In Philadelphia, I managed my aunt's household and her business correspondence for years. I'm more than capable of the duties you describe." Something like surprise flickered across his features before he controlled it. "Very well. Mrs. Winters will provide the household ledgers. I've instructed the bank to open an account in your name for household expenses." As they spoke, Abigail couldn't help but notice the way exhaustion lined his face, the slight tremor in his hand as he sorted through papers. This was not merely a man focused on business. This was a man driving himself to the point of collapse. "You work too hard," she observed. Mason's laugh held no humor. "Hard work builds everything you see, Mrs. Blackwood. It's the only reliable foundation in this world." "Even foundations need maintenance," she replied. "When did you last eat a proper meal, or sleep for more than a few hours?" His eyes narrowed. "My health is not your concern. As your wife, even in name only, I disagree." Abigail rose. "Luncheon should be ready. Afterwards, perhaps you might show me the mine that warranted such an unusual business arrangement." For a moment she thought he might refuse. Then, surprisingly, Mason nodded. "Very well. The Silverton Company representatives have postponed it until tomorrow. I can spare an hour to show you the operation." He stood, his considerable height emphasized by the way he seemed to unfold from the chair. "You might as well understand what you've married into, Mrs. Blackwood, both its value and its dangers." The Silver Star mine sprawled across the mountainside like an industrial fortress. Steam-powered machinery thundered and clanked, while men covered in rock dust moved with practiced efficiency between the mine entrance and the various outbuildings. The sour, sweet smell of crushed ore and chemical agents hung in the air, mingling with wood smoke and sweat. "Impressive," Abigail said, taking in the scale of the operation. She had dressed practically for the tour in her sturdiest boots and
a simple skirt.
knowing from Betsy's comments that the mine was no place for finery. Mason's expression held a hint of pride as he surveyed his domain. The Silver Star produces more silver per month than all other mines in the county combined. 300. Men work these tunnels in shifts around the clock. And the land from my aunt's deed? Abigail asked. The Whispering Pines claim? His expression changed subtly. We'll come to that. As they approached the main shaft entrance, workers doffed their caps respectfully. Abigail noticed the mix of reactions to her presence: surprise, curiosity, and in some cases, open appreciation. Of her appearance, Mrs. Blackwood, Mason said, introducing her to a barrel-chested man with intelligent eyes. This is Samuel Drummond, my foreman. Ma'am? Drummond nodded, clearly struggling to reconcile this elegant woman with whatever he'd been told about Mason's mail-order bride. Welcome to Silver Creek. Mr. Drummond oversees all operations, Mason explained. He's been with me since I dug the first exploratory shaft 12 years ago, when we couldn't afford dynamite and used pickaxes instead, Drummond added with a wry smile. Before Mr. Blackwood here became the Silver King of Colorado. Mason dismissed the comment with a gesture. Show Mrs. Blackwood the new stamp mill. I need to check the western drift. When Mason disappeared into the mine entrance, Drummond led Abigail toward a large structure housing massive machinery. Didn't expect the boss to marry, he commented as they walked. Especially not someone like you, if you don't mind my saying. Someone. Like me? Abigail raised an eyebrow. Drummond's weathered face flushed slightly. Just meant, well, you're a proper lady. Boss has never shown interest in socializing, let alone matrimony. Inside the mill, conversation became impossible as the deafening crash of the stamps crushing ore drowned out all other sounds. Abigail watched in fascination as silver-bearing rock was processed through various stages of refinement. When they emerged back into daylight, Drummond continued his explanation of the operation. Abigail listened attentively, asking questions that clearly surprised the foreman with their perceptiveness. You know something about mining, Mrs. Blackwood? He asked eventually. Not at all, she admitted, but I understand business principles. My late aunt ran a successful textile operation in Philadelphia. Drummond nodded thoughtfully. Boss could use someone with a head for business these days. He's been driving himself too hard since, well, for some time now. Since what, Mr. Drummond? Abigail pressed, sensing important information beneath the man's hesitation. Before he could respond, Mason reappeared, his expression darker than when he'd left them. The western drift needs additional support beams, he told Drummond curtly. See to it immediately. Yes, sir. Drummond tipped his hat to Abigail before hurrying away. Mason turned to her. You've seen enough for today. The afternoon shift change brings chaos. As they walked back toward the carriage, Abigail noticed a narrow trail winding up the mountainside away from the main operation. Where does that lead? She asked. Mason glanced where she pointed, his jaw tightening. Nowhere of importance. It seems well-traveled for nowhere, Abigail observed. It leads to an abandoned exploratory shaft, he said finally, one of many failed attempts before we found the main silver vein. His tone discouraged further questions, but Abigail filed the information away. There was something about the path and Mason's reaction that suggested significance beyond what he claimed. That evening, dinner proved a silent affair until Abigail deliberately broached a subject she knew would provoke response. I'd like to open an account at the Mercantile in town, she announced. The household requires several items, and I need fabrics for new curtains and linens. Mason looked up from his barely touched plate. New curtains? This house has none in half its rooms, Abigail pointed out. The morning sun is blinding, particularly in the east wing. Mrs. Winters handles household. Purchases, and I'm sure she does so admirably, Abigail replied. But as you stated earlier, managing the household is now my responsibility, unless you've reconsidered. Mason studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Very well. I'll have Jenkins take you to town tomorrow and introduce you to Pearson at the Mercantile. Establish whatever accounts you need. Thank you. Abigail paused, then added, I'd also like to open a small workroom. I've brought my sewing equipment and... A workroom? Mason interrupted, genuine surprise breaking through his controlled facade. Whatever for? I was a seamstress in Philadelphia, Mr. Blackwood. It's a skill I take pride in and have no intention of abandoning simply because my circumstances have changed. Mason set down his fork. You needn't work anymore. The household account will provide adequately for your personal needs. It's not about money, Abigail explained. Sewing brings me satisfaction. Surely you can understand finding purpose in one's work. Something shifted in his expression, a fleeting glimpse of recognition, perhaps even respect. The east corner room on the second floor is unoccupied. You may use it as you wish. Thank you. Abigail took a sip of water, then ventured into more personal territory. Mr. Drummond seems very loyal to you. Sam's a good man, Mason agreed. One of the few I trust completely. He mentioned you've been driving yourself particularly hard since something, though he didn't complete the thought. Has there been trouble at the mine? Mason's expression closed immediately. Drummond talks too much. There's always trouble in mining. It's the nature of the business. Flooding, cave-ins, equipment failures. Managing these challenges is simply part of ensuring profitability. His deflection was skillful but revealing. Whatever Drummond had been referring to, it clearly remained a sensitive subject. The next morning, Walter Jenkins arrived after breakfast to escort Abigail into
Town.
The attorney seemed more relaxed away from Mason's presence, and Abigail seized the opportunity to gather information. How long have you worked for Mr. Blackwood, Mr. Jenkins? She asked, as their carriage descended toward Silver Creek. Nearly a decade, Jenkins replied. I handled the legal work when he expanded beyond his original claim. And in all that time, he never married? Jenkins shot her a sideways glance. Mr. Blackwood has always been singularly focused on his business interests. Until now, Abigail observed. What makes my aunt's land so valuable that he'd enter a marriage of convenience to acquire it? Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. That's really a question for your husband, Mrs. Blackwood. My husband seems disinclined to discuss the matter. Abigail turned to face the attorney directly. Mr. Jenkins, I entered this arrangement with open eyes, but I find myself at a disadvantage. The more I understand about my new circumstances, the better I can navigate them. The attorney sighed. The Whispering Pines claim has been a point of contention for some time. Your aunt refused multiple offers from various interested parties, including Mr. Blackwood. Why? What makes it valuable? Geological surveys suggest the main silver vein from the Silver Star might extend into that property, Jenkins admitted, but previous exploratory efforts yielded nothing substantial. Then why would my aunt refuse to sell? She had no interest in mining. Jenkins hesitated. Margaret Foster was an unusual woman with strong convictions. She visited the property only once, years ago, but afterward became adamant about preserving it. This new information puzzled Abigail. Her aunt had never mentioned visiting Colorado, let alone developing strong opinions about a seemingly worthless plot of land. Silver Creek in daylight proved livelier than Abigail's first impression had suggested. Miners from the morning shift filled the saloon, while women moved purposefully between the various shops. Several people stopped to stare as Abigail passed, clearly curious about Mason Blackwood's new wife. At the Mercantile, Jenkins introduced her to Theodore Pearson, the proprietor. The middle-aged shopkeeper's eyes widened noticeably when Jenkins presented her as Mrs. Blackwood. "A pleasure, ma'am," Pearson said, recovering quickly. "We'd heard Mr. Blackwood had married, but—" He trailed off, clearly surprised by her. "Appearance? Yes, it was a rather hurried affair," Abigail replied smoothly. "I'll need to establish accounts for household purchases and personal items." As Pearson processed the necessary paperwork, the bell above the door jingled. A striking woman with copper-red hair entered, dressed in an expensive gown that seemed out of place in the frontier town. "Mr. Pearson, I need—" The woman stopped abruptly when she spotted Abigail, her green eyes narrowing. "Well, well, you must be Mason's mail-order bride." Jenkins cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Blackwood, may I present Miss Vivian Hayes?" Vivian approached, openly assessing Abigail with a gaze that managed to be both calculating and contemptuous. "The rumors didn't do you justice. I expected someone far more provincial." "How disappointing for you," Abigail replied evenly. Vivian's perfectly arched eyebrows rose. "Not at all. I do enjoy surprises." She turned to Jenkins. "And what brings the esteemed Mrs. Blackwood to our humble settlement so soon after her nuptials? Surely Mason hasn't tired of her already." "Mrs. Blackwood is establishing household accounts," Jenkins explained stiffly. "How domestic." Vivian's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You must join me for tea sometime, Mrs. Blackwood. I'm sure we have much to discuss, perhaps about the curious timing of your marriage to Mason." With that parting shot, Vivian collected her package from the counter and swept out of the store, leaving a cloud of expensive perfume in her wake. "Who exactly is Miss Hayes?" Abigail asked when the door closed behind the woman. Pearson and Jenkins exchanged glances. "Miss Hayes is the daughter of Edward Hayes, who owns the Monarch Mine," Jenkins explained reluctantly. "Their operation is second only to the Silver Star in production, and her connection to my husband." Jenkins looked distinctly uncomfortable. "She and Mr. Blackwood have been acquainted for some time." "I see." Abigail carefully controlled her expression. While she had no romantic claims on Mason, Vivian's hostility suggested the redhead had expected a very different outcome to her relationship with Silver Creek's wealthiest mine owner. As they left the mercantile, Abigail noticed a small crowd gathered outside the assayer's office across the street. A heated argument was underway between a grey-haired man in worn work clothes and a younger, well-dressed gentleman. "The claim is legally mine now, Parker," the younger man was saying. "The bank foreclosed fair and square. 20 years I've worked that ground," the older man protested. "One bad season and Blackwood's bank swoops in like vultures." Jenkins quickly ushered Abigail toward their waiting carriage. "Pay it no mind," he advised. "Common disputes in a mining town." "Did he say Blackwood's bank?" Abigail asked as they pulled away. Jenkins nodded reluctantly. "Mr. Blackwood holds controlling interest in Silver Creek Savings and Loan. It's a necessary part of doing business in a remote location." Abigail fell silent, assembling these new pieces of information. In her mind, Mason Blackwood wasn't merely a successful mine owner. He controlled the town's financial systems, had a complicated relationship with the daughter of his chief competitor, and had gone to extraordinary lengths to acquire a piece of property that supposedly held little value. The picture forming was of a man far more complex, and perhaps more ruthless, than she had initially understood. 2 weeks passed as Abigail settled into life at Blackwood Manor. She transformed the East corner room into a bright workroom, arranging her sewing supplies and fabrics with the practiced efficiency of someone returning to a beloved craft. True to his word, Mason provided whatever she requested for household improvements, though he remained distant, often leaving before dawn and returning well after dinner had grown cold. On those rare evenings when they dined together, conversation remained superficial. Mason would inquire about household matters, Abigail would report on her progress with the new curtains or bed linens. Neither ventured into personal territory, maintaining the polite facade of their business arrangement. Yet Abigail found herself studying him when he wasn't aware, the way exhaustion shadowed his eyes, how his hands sometimes trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching, the careful way he controlled his expressions whenever certain topics arose. "You're still not sleeping," she observed one evening, breaking their unspoken agreement to maintain emotional distance. Mason looked up from the mining report he'd been reviewing at the dinner table. "I beg your pardon?" "You've lost weight since I arrived," Abigail continued. "Your hands shake when you're tired, and Mrs. Winters says you pace the study until dawn most nights." His expression hardened. "My health is not your concern. As I said before, I disagree. Whatever our arrangement, your well-being affects this household." She set down her fork. "Is it the mine?" "Mr. Drummond mentioned production has decreased in the western shaft. Drummond talks entirely too much," Mason muttered, though without real anger. After a moment's hesitation, he added, "We've encountered some challenging geological formations. Nothing unusual in mining, and the Silverton Company representatives? Their visit has been postponed twice now." A muscle twitches in Mason's jaw. "They're considering an investment partnership. The timing must be right." Abigail sensed she was approaching territory he preferred to keep private. She changed tactics. "I completed the new dining room curtains today. Perhaps you'd like to see them." The sudden shift seemed to catch him off guard. He glanced at the windows, noticing for the first time the deep blue brocade panels framing the evening view of the valley. "They're suitable," he said finally. "High." "Praise indeed," Abigail remarked dryly. "Next week I'll begin on the library. That eastern exposure makes reading difficult in the mornings." Mason studied her for a moment. "You've made significant changes in a short time." "Is that disapproval I hear?" "Observation," he corrected. "This house has seen more transformation in 2 weeks than in the past 5 years. Abigail held his gaze. "A house should be more than merely functional, Mr. Blackwood. Even a business arrangement deserves proper curtains." Something flickered in his eyes, amusement perhaps, before he returned to his papers. "Indeed, Mrs. Blackwood, whatever you think best." The following day, Abigail decided to venture into town alone. She had orders to place at the Mercantile and questions that couldn't be asked with Jenkins hovering nearby. She borrowed the smaller carriage, waving off Mrs. Winters' objections about propriety. Silver Creek was bustling with morning activity when she arrived. At the Mercantile, Theodore Pearson greeted her warmly, clearly having adjusted to the idea that Mason Blackwood's wife was both beautiful and independent. "Mrs. Blackwood, a pleasure to see you again. What can I help you with today?" Abigail placed her order for household supplies, then added, "I'm also seeking information, Mr. Pearson, about my aunt, Margaret Foster." Pearson's bushy eyebrows rose. "Miss Foster? Can't say I knew her well, but she visited some years back, caused quite a stir." "A stir? How so?" The shopkeeper glanced around to ensure no other customers were within earshot. "Well, it wasn't common for unmarried ladies to travel alone in those days. She stayed at the hotel for nearly a month, making daily trips out to that claim of hers with old Jim Parker guiding her." "Jim Parker?" The name sounded familiar. Local prospector. Good man, down on his luck these days since the bank foreclosed on his claim. Pearson lowered his voice further. "Some say your husband engineered that particular foreclosure, though. That's just talk, of course." Abigail recalled the argument she'd witnessed during her previous visit. "This Parker, would I find him at the assayer's office?" Pearson shook his head. "More likely at Sullivan's saloon this time of morning, though that's hardly a suitable place for a lady like yourself." After leaving the Mercantile, Abigail hesitated only briefly before directing her steps toward the weathered building with Sullivan's painted in fading letters above the door. Taking a deep breath, she pushed through the swinging doors. Conversation halted instantly. A dozen pairs of eyes turned toward her, miners enjoying a drink after. The night shift, card players hunched over worn tables, and the barman frozen in the act of wiping a glass. "I'm looking for Jim Parker," Abigail announced, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. A grizzled man in the corner raised his hand. "That'd be me, ma'am, though I don't believe we've had the pleasure." Abigail crossed the room, ignoring the whispers that followed her. "Mr. Parker, I'm Abigail Blackwood, Margaret Foster's niece." Recognition dawned in the old prospector's bloodshot eyes. "Maggie Foster's kin? Well, I'll be—" He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please, sit. Never thought I'd see the day Mason Blackwood's wife would seek me out." As Abigail settled across from him, the saloon gradually returned to its normal hum of activity, though many curious glances still came their way. "I understand you guided my aunt when she visited her property," Abigail began. Parker nodded, taking a sip from his whiskey glass. 20-some years ago now. Remarkable woman, your aunt. Knew nothing about mining when she arrived, but asked sharper questions than men who'd been digging all their lives." What exactly was she looking for out there? The land has no producing. "Mine." The old prospector's eyes narrowed. "That's what everyone thinks, your husband included until recently." He leaned forward. "Your aunt didn't come for silver, Mrs. Blackwood. She came because of the old stories." "Stories?" Parker glanced around before continuing in a lower voice. "The original native peoples of this valley had legends about the mountain where your aunt's claim sits. Called it the Whispering Pine Mountain because of the sounds the wind makes through those old trees. Said the mountain held a treasure more valuable than gold or silver. What kind of treasure? That's the thing. The stories never specified, but your aunt, she took those legends seriously, spent weeks exploring every inch of that property." A shadow crossed Parker's weathered face. "Found something too, I reckon. The day before she left, she made me swear never to tell anyone about a certain cave we discovered high on the eastern slope." Abigail leaned forward. "And did you keep that promise?" "Until recently." Shame flickered in Parker's eyes. "Times got hard. My claim wasn't correct. The bank, Blackwood's bank, was threatening foreclosure. When your husband approached me last year, offering good money for information about Miss Foster's activities—" He shrugged helplessly. "A man's got to eat." "So you told him about the cave?" Parker nodded. "Showed him the location, too. He's had men working up there secretly for months now. That's what I heard anyway. Small crew, sworn to secrecy. The narrow trail leading away from the main mining operation, the one Mason had dismissed as an abandoned exploratory shaft." The pieces were beginning to fit together. "Mr. Parker, why would my aunt include that strange provision in her will? Why insist the land could only pass through marriage or direct inheritance?" The old prospector drained his glass. "My guess, she wanted to protect whatever she found up there. Make sure it didn't fall into just anyone's hands." He studied Abigail thoughtfully, though I doubt she anticipated her niece would be the one to marry Mason Blackwood. As Abigail left the saloon, her mind whirled with new information and questions. What had her aunt discovered in that mountain cave? What was Mason secretly mining there? And why had he gone to such lengths to keep it hidden from both his competitors and his own foreman? She was so preoccupied that she nearly collided with Vivian Hayes outside the assayer's office. "Mrs. Blackwood," Vivian purred, her green eyes glittering with malice. "How delightful to find you slumming among the common folk. Does Mason know his bride frequents saloons unescorted?" "Miss Hayes," Abigail acknowledged coolly, "I wasn't aware I needed my husband's permission to conduct business in town." "Business in Sullivan's?" Vivian laughed. "How fascinating. I wonder what Mason would make of that." "Feel free to inform him," Abigail replied. "We have no secrets." Vivian's perfect features arranged themselves into a pitying smile. "Oh, my dear, If you believe that, you understand even less than I thought. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. Did he tell you about the fire? About what really happened to his first attempt at developing your aunt's property? About the men who died? Abigail maintained her composed expression despite the shock of Vivian's words. Perhaps you should direct your concerns to my husband. He won't talk about it, Vivian said. Not to anyone, but everyone in Silver Creek remembers. 3 men died in that cave. Burned alive, they say. Her smile turned vicious. Ask him, Mrs. Blackwood. Ask him what he's really looking for in the Whispering Pines. With that, Vivian swept past, leaving Abigail standing frozen on the boardwalk, her mind racing with these new, disturbing revelations. That night, as Mason worked late in his study, Abigail made a decision. If he wouldn't provide answers, she would find them herself. Tomorrow, while he was occupied with the Silverton representatives, she would follow that narrow trail up the mountainside and discover what secret lay hidden in her aunt's property. What was valuable enough to kill for, to marry for. Whatever Mason Blackwood was hiding in the Whispering Pines, Abigail intended to uncover it, regardless of the consequences to their arrangement. Dawn had barely broken when Abigail slipped from the house, dressed in her simplest skirt, sturdiest boots, and a warm jacket borrowed from the mudroom. She left a note for Mrs. Winters claiming she was gathering pine boughs for decorative arrangements, a flimsy excuse, but one that might buy her enough time. The morning air carried a biting chill as she saddled one of the gentler horses from the stable. She'd observed the grooms enough times to manage the task, though her inexperienced hands struggled with the cinch. "Need some help with that, Ma'am?" Abigail startled at the voice, turning to find Samuel Drummond watching her from the stable doorway. "Mr. Drummond," she managed, her heart racing. "I didn't expect anyone to be here so early." The foreman approached, his expression curious but not suspicious. Was heading up to check the support beams in the western drift before shift change. He gestured toward her half-saddled horse. "Though I might ask what brings Mrs. Blackwood to the stables at dawn." Abigail made a quick decision. Drummond had worked with Mason for years, but something in the foreman's manner suggested he might be trusted. "I'm investigating something," she admitted. "Something concerning my aunt's property, the Whispering Pines claim." Drummond's weather-worn face registered surprise, then concern. "That's remote territory, Ma'am. Not safe for a lady alone, especially one not familiar with the mountain." "Then perhaps I require a guide," Abigail suggested, meeting his gaze directly. "Someone who knows the area, but isn't directly involved in whatever Mr. Blackwood is doing." "Up there," the foreman's eyes widened slightly. "You know about that?" "I know there's a secret operation. I know 3 men died in a fire. And I know my husband won't tell me what he's looking for." She straightened her shoulders. "As his wife and the previous owner's niece, I believe I have a right to know." Drummond studied her for a long moment, conflict evident in his expression. Finally, he sighed. "The boss won't like this." "I'm not asking you to betray him," Abigail said softly. "Just to ensure I don't break my neck trying to find answers on my own. Which you'd do anyway, I reckon." Drummond shook his head ruefully. "Give me 5 minutes to saddle my horse." As they rode toward the mountain trail, the rising sun cast long shadows across the valley. Drummond led them on a route that skirted the main mining operation, explaining that the morning shift would be changing soon. "How long have you known Mr. Blackwood?" Abigail asked as they began ascending the narrow path that branched from the main mine road. "Since before he was Mr. Blackwood," Drummond replied. "Back when he was just Mason, a skinny prospector with nothing but determination and a borrowed mule." "He doesn't speak of those days." "No, he wouldn't." Drummond guided his horse around a tricky bend. "Mason came west with nothing. Worked claims for others until he could stake his own. Most folks don't know how close he came to failing those. First years. Lived on beans and hope, worked 18 hours a day. What changed his fortunes? Struck silver in 75, right before you reach that ridge up ahead. Small vein at first, but he reinvested every penny, expanded methodically. Respect colored Drummond's voice. Never seen a man with such focus. By 80, the Silver Star was producing enough to attract Eastern investors. They rode in silence for a while, the trail growing steeper. Finally, Abigail asked the question that had been troubling her most. What happened in the fire Miss Hayes mentioned? The one where men died. Drummond's expression darkened. That was 3 years back, after your aunt refused to sell the Whispering. Pine's claim, Mason leased a small section for exploration, sent a crew up to an old cave system on the eastern slope. He hesitated. Something went wrong. Lantern oil spilled, they said. Fire spread too quick for the men to escape. But you don't believe it was an accident? The foreman glanced at her sharply. Didn't say that. You didn't have to, Abigail urged, her horse alongside his. What really happened, Mr. Drummond? He sighed heavily. The timing was suspicious. Happened right after Mason reported finding something significant. Though he never said what. Fire destroyed everything, including his documentation. Investigation concluded it was an accident, but one survivor, a young fella named Tanner, swore he saw someone fleeing just before the fire started. No one believed him. Boy was badly burned, in shock. Died a few days later. Sabotage, Abigail murmured. From a competitor? Drummond shrugged. Can't say for certain. Hayes from the Monarch mine would benefit most from keeping Mason from expanding, and his daughter has always had influence over Mason. Were they engaged? Abigail asked, recalling Vivian's territorial behavior. Not officially, but it was understood they would marry eventually, until Mason suddenly arranged to marry you instead. Drummond shot her a meaningful glance. Created quite a stir. They rounded a bend, and Drummond gestured for her to stop. We're approaching. The site. Mason has 2 men guarding it at all times. We'll need to be careful. He led them on a less obvious path that circled behind a stand of towering pines. The trees here grew unusually tall and thick, their needles creating a soft carpet that muffled their horses' hooves. The wind whistled through the branches with an eerie, almost musical quality. The whispering pines, Abigail murmured, understanding now the origin of the claim's name. Drummond nodded. Local tribes believed the spirits of their ancestors spoke through these trees. Consider this whole mountain sacred ground. They dismounted and secured their horses, continuing on foot through the dense forest. After several minutes of careful navigation, they reached a vantage point overlooking a small clearing. Below, Abigail could see the entrance to a cave partially obscured by newly constructed timber supports. 2 armed men stood guard, while occasional sounds of activity emerged from within. That's it, Drummond whispered. Whatever Mason's looking. For it's in there. Abigail studied the scene, frustration mounting. They couldn't get closer without being seen, and even if they could, the guards prevented any chance of entering the cave. There must be another way in, she said softly. My aunt spent weeks exploring this property. She would have documented everything. A thought struck her suddenly. The deed, she murmured. Mason keeps it locked in his desk drawer. What if Aunt Margaret included more than just legal property descriptions? Drummond gave her a considerate look. Mason's at the mine today, meeting the Silverton representatives. His study would be empty. We should return, Abigail decided, before our absence is noticed. As they made their way back to their horses, a crack of breaking branches made them freeze. Drummond pulled Abigail behind a massive pine trunk, just as 2 men emerged from the forest path. Miners by their clothing, carrying supply packs toward the cave. Hayes is increasing the offer, one was saying. 5,000 now for information on what Blackwood's found. Not worth my life, the other replied. You know what the boss would do if he caught someone spying? Just saying, that's a lot of money. especially since rumor has it whatever's in that cave ain't even silver or gold. Their voices faded as they continued toward the cave entrance, leaving Abigail and Drummond exchanging significant glances. Not silver or gold, Abigail repeated. Then what is my husband mining in secret? The return journey passed in contemplative silence, both riders absorbed in their thoughts. As they approached the Blackwood property, Drummond suggested they separate. "I'll return to the main operation," he said. "Best if we're not seen arriving. Together, the men talk." Abigail nodded her understanding. "Thank you, Mr. Drummond. I won't forget your assistance today." The foreman hesitated. "Mrs. Blackwood, I've worked with Mason for many years. He's a hard man, driven, sometimes ruthless in business, but he's not evil. Whatever he's doing up there, he has his reasons." "I intend to discover those reasons," Abigail replied firmly. She returned the horse to the stable without incident, relieved to find Mrs. Winters had accepted her excuse without question. The housekeeper mentioned that Mr. Blackwood had sent word he would be detained at the mine until evening. The meeting with the Silverton representatives was apparently proceeding well. After changing into a proper house dress, Abigail made her way to Mason's private study. The door, as expected, was locked. She hesitated only briefly before retrieving a set of thin metal tools from her sewing room, implements designed for detailed embroidery work, but equally suited to manipulating a simple lock mechanism. Her father's financial troubles had forced her to develop unusual skills during her youth. Before his death and her move to her aunt's home, she had spent months helping him sort through creditors' property, often requiring access to locked cabinets and rooms whose keys had been misplaced. In their reduced circumstances, the lock yielded after several tense minutes of careful manipulation. Abigail slipped inside, closing the door behind her. The study smelled of leather, tobacco, and the faint chemical odor that clung to Mason's clothes after visits to the mine. Unlike the impersonal nature of the rest of the house, this room contained glimpses of the man himself, geological texts with handwritten notes in the margins, a worn volume of Thoreau's Walden, sketches of mining equipment improvements in Mason's precise hand. The massive oak desk dominated the room, its surface organized with military precision. Abigail moved behind it, trying the top drawer where she had seen Mason place the deed. Locked, as expected. Again, her improvised lockpicks proved their worth. Inside, she found the deed to the Whispering Pines claim, along with several other documents related to the property. Unfolding the deed carefully, she examined it for any hidden information. Her aunt might have included. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard legal document describing property boundaries and mineral rights. But as Abigail turned it over, she noticed faint impressions on the back, as though someone had written on another paper placed atop this one. She recalled a technique her aunt had taught her for revealing such impressions. Taking a pencil from Mason's desk, she lightly shaded across the paper, gradually revealing words and what appeared to be a crude map. "Not silver, not gold," she read aloud, her heart quickening. "The water that burns. Eastern Cave, second chamber, MF. Dubai." "Water that burns," Abigail frowned in confusion. Below these cryptic words, the roughly sketched map showed what appeared to be the cave system, with one chamber marked prominently. As she studied the revealed message, the unmistakable sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. Voices in the foyer, Mason's deep tones responding to Mrs. Winters. He had returned early. Abigail quickly replaced the deed, closed and relocked the drawer, and glanced around to ensure nothing appeared disturbed. She had just reached the study door when footsteps approached from the hallway. No time to pick the lock again. She turned the handle silently and eased the door open just enough to slip through, closing it behind her, only to find herself face to face with Mason Blackwood, his hand raised as if about to reach for the doorknob himself. For a moment they stared at each other in frozen silence. Mason's dark eyes moved from her face to the door of his private study, comprehension dawning in his expression. "Looking for something, Mrs. Blackwood?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. Abigail's mind raced, searching for a plausible explanation. "I was looking for you, actually," she managed, striving to keep her voice steady. "Mrs. Winters mentioned you'd returned early. I wanted to discuss household accounts." Mason's eyes narrowed, suspicion evident in his expression. "In my private study? The one room in this house that remains locked at all times?" "The door was ajar," Abigail lied, meeting his gaze with as much innocence as she could muster. "I assumed you were inside." For several agonizing moments, Mason studied her face, clearly weighing her explanation against his own suspicions. Abigail forced herself to breathe normally, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "A curious coincidence," he said finally. "I'm certain I locked it this morning." He reached past her to try the handle, finding it securely locked. Confusion flickered across his features before his expression hardened again. "I must have been mistaken," Abigail offered, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Perhaps I confused this door with the library. The upper hallway can be quite dim." Mason produced a key from his waistcoat pocket and unlocked the study door, scanning the room as he entered. Abigail held her breath, praying she'd left no evidence of her intrusion. His gaze lingered on the desk, but he seemed to find nothing amiss. "You mentioned household accounts," he prompted, turning back to her. "Yes," Abigail improvised. "I've been reviewing the expenditures for the past month. There are some discrepancies I thought you should be aware of." "Discrepancies?" Mason arched an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Mrs. Winters has been ordering supplies at considerably higher prices than market value," Abigail continued, drawing on an actual observation she'd made days earlier. "Particularly from Henderson's Hardware. I suspect some arrangement between them." Mason's expression shifted from suspicion to reluctant interest. "Show me," he said, gesturing for her to enter the study. Relief washed over Abigail as she stepped past him into the room. She'd bought herself time, if nothing else. As she fabricated details about household accounting, her mind worked furiously on the real mystery, the water that burns her aunt had mentioned, and how it connected to whatever Mason was extracting from the Whispering Pines cave. Later that evening, after a tense dinner where Mason watched her with calculating eyes, Abigail retreated to her room and locked the door. She couldn't shake the feeling that her husband suspected her activities, despite her careful performance. If she was going to uncover the truth, she needed to act quickly. Taking out a sheet of paper, she attempted to recreate the map she'd seen on the back of the deed. The cave system had appeared complex, with multiple chambers, but her aunt had specifically marked one location. If Abigail could find another entrance to the cave system, she might be able to reach that chamber without confronting the guards at the main entrance. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She quickly covered her notes with a sewing pattern before calling, "Yes? A package arrived for you, Ma'am," came Betsy's voice. "From Philadelphia." Abigail opened the door to find the young maid holding a small wooden crate. "Thank you, Betsy. Was Mr. Blackwood informed of this delivery?" "No, ma'am. It came after he returned to the mine. Said something about checking night operations." After Betsy departed, Abigail examined the package. She hadn't been expecting anything from Philadelphia. The return address showed it was from her aunt's former solicitor, Mr. Hargreaves, who had handled the transfer of Margaret Foster's assets after her death. Using a letter opener to pry open the crate, Abigail found it contained several items: a leather-bound journal, a small wooden box, and a sealed letter addressed to her in her aunt's distinctive handwriting. With trembling fingers, Abigail broke the seal. "My dearest Abigail, if you are reading this, then you have married to secure the whispering pines claim, as my will required. I pray your husband is a man of principle, though I fear the value of what lies beneath those ancient trees will attract those motivated by greed rather than stewardship. What I discovered in the mountains of Colorado is beyond price. Not gold or silver, but something far more valuable to our nation's future. The native people knew of it for generations, but protected its secret from those who would exploit it without understanding its true importance. The journal contains my observations and the exact location of the eastern cave entrance, hidden from casual observation and known only to old Jim Parker and myself. The box contains proof of my discovery. Be cautious, my dear. There are those who would kill for this knowledge, as I have reason to believe they already have. With love and faith in your judgment, Aunt Margaret, heart pounding, Abigail opened the small wooden box. Inside lay a glass vial containing a dark, viscous liquid. When she carefully removed the stopper, a strong, distinctive odor filled the room. Something chemical, potent, and vaguely familiar. The journal provided the answer in her aunt's precise handwriting, May 18th, 1865. Jim Parker led me to the Eastern Cave today. What we discovered confirms the tribal legends. The water that burns flows from deep within the mountain, what modern science calls petroleum, but in a form more pure than any yet discovered in Pennsylvania or elsewhere. The potential implications for industry are staggering. The ancient people believed this substance held spiritual power. They used small amounts for ceremonial purposes, but deliberately obscured knowledge of its source from early settlers, understanding instinctively that white men would destroy the mountain to extract it. I have taken samples, but will not reveal the location. This discovery must be handled with care and respect for both the land and its potential impact on our nation's development. Petroleum, not silver or gold, but black gold, the increasingly valuable fuel source powering America's industrial revolution. Abigail's mind raced as the pieces finally clicked into place. Mason wasn't mining precious metals from the whispering pines. He was secretly extracting oil, possibly the first major petroleum discovery in Colorado Territory. Tatchaford's potential value was immeasurable, far beyond even the richest silver strike. No wonder he had gone to such lengths to acquire the property. No wonder competitors like Hayes would resort to sabotage and murder. Control of such a resource could reshape the economic landscape of the entire region. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window, making Abigail jump. She moved to secure the latch and caught sight of movement in the yard below. Mason, returning from the mine earlier than expected, his expression grim as he dismounted. She had to act quickly. Tomorrow, using her aunt's journal, she would find the eastern entrance to the cave system. Before Mason discovered what she knew, before he could stop her, she had to see for herself what lay beneath the whispering pines. Dawn broke with heavy clouds threatening rain. Perfect cover for Abigail's expedition. She dressed in her most practical clothing, tucking her aunt's journal securely in her pocket. The vial of petroleum remained hidden beneath the false bottom of her sewing basket, along with Margaret's letter. The household stirred with its usual morning rhythm as Abigail slipped downstairs. To her relief, Mason had already departed for the mine. Another early meeting with the Silverton representatives, according to Mrs. Winters. "I'll be gathering wild herbs today," Abigail informed the housekeeper, "for medicinal tinctures. My aunt taught me some useful preparations." Mrs. Winters frowned disapprovingly. "In this weather, ma'am. Looks to be storming soon." "The rain brings out certain mushrooms," Abigail improvised, "very beneficial for chest complaints." Without waiting for further objections, she collected a basket and headed toward the stables. This time, she chose a different horse. a sure-footed mare that Drummond had mentioned was especially good on mountain trails. According to her aunt's journal, the eastern entrance to the cave system lay approximately 2 miles from the main path, hidden behind a distinctive rock formation shaped like a wolf howling at the moon. Margaret's detailed drawings would help Abigail locate it, assuming nothing had changed in the decades since her aunt's visit. The ascent proved challenging as the trail grew faint, then disappeared altogether. Twice, Abigail had to dismount and lead the mare through particularly treacherous sections. The threatening storm had driven most wildlife to shelter. The mountain seemed eerily quiet, except for the whisper of wind through the ancient pines. After nearly 2 hours of careful navigation, Abigail spotted the wolf-shaped rock formation. Standing over 30 feet tall, the weathered granite did indeed resemble a wolf, with its muzzle raised to the sky. She secured her horse to a sturdy pine and approached on foot, journal in hand. The cave mouth lies 15 paces southwest of the wolf's tail, she read from Margaret's notes, obscured by a growth of scrub pine and easily missed if one doesn't know precisely where to look. Following these instructions, Abigail counted her steps carefully. The entrance, when she found it, was so well concealed she nearly walked past. It a narrow fissure in the rock face, partially hidden by dense vegetation. Kneeling, she peered into the darkness. A cool draft emerged from the opening, carrying a faint chemical smell that matched the petroleum sample. Abigail retrieved the small lantern she'd brought, lit it, and steeled her nerves. "For you, Aunt Margaret," she whispered and squeezed. Through the narrow entrance, the passage widened almost immediately, allowing her to stand. Years of mountain runoff had smoothed the floor, making it less treacherous than she'd feared. Her lantern cast dancing shadows on walls that glittered with mineral deposits. Following her aunt's map, Abigail navigated through the twisting passages. The distinct sound of water dripping echoed from somewhere deeper in the cave system. After several minutes, the tunnel opened into a large chamber with a high domed ceiling. Breathtaking formations of stalactites hung like stone icicles, the product of thousands of years of patient geology. But it was what lay on the chamber floor that captured Abigail's complete attention. A pool of dark liquid reflected her lantern. Light, its surface occasionally disturbed by drops falling from the ceiling. The smell here was much stronger, unmistakably petroleum. Along one wall, someone had recently installed wooden supports and a rudimentary pumping system connected to pipes that disappeared into a side tunnel. Mason's operation. This chamber connected to the main entrance her husband's men guarded, though from this vantage point, Abigail couldn't see or hear them. Careful to remain quiet, she approached the pool, observing how the oil seeped continuously from a crack in the rocky floor. Her aunt's journal had described this phenomenon. Nature's own well requiring no drilling. The petroleum rises naturally through fissures in the limestone, collecting in this underground basin. I estimate the reserve below must be vast, perhaps the largest yet discovered on American soil. Abigail dipped a finger into the liquid, feeling its slick texture. This substance powered lamps across America, lubricated industrial machinery, and was revealing new uses with each passing year. Its value would only increase as the nation's hunger for energy grew. Quite a discovery, isn't it? The voice from behind her sent Abigail spinning around, nearly dropping her lantern. Mason Blackwood stood in the passage she had used to enter, his own light casting his face in sharp relief. "How?" she began. "Did I know you'd be here?" He stepped further into the chamber. "You're not as subtle as you think, Abigail. Mrs. Winters reported your flimsy excuse about herbs. The stable hand mentioned your interest in the eastern trails. And then there's this." He held up a familiar leather-bound journal, her aunt's journal. "You searched my room," Abigail said, anger replacing her initial shock. "As you searched my study." His expression remained unreadable. I suspected something when I found my desk drawer locked, but slightly misaligned. You're skilled with locks, but the drawer has a nearly imperceptible mark I used to detect tampering. Abigail straightened her shoulders, refusing to show fear, despite her racing heart. Then you know I've discovered your secret, not silver, but petroleum, the water that burns. That's why you married me, to gain control of this land. Yes. Mason moved closer, his gaze shifting from her face to the dark pool. Though I didn't expect my homely, desperate bride to be quite so resourceful, or quite so beautiful, Abigail challenged. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. That too. Why all the secrecy? She demanded. Why not simply develop it openly once you acquired the deed? Mason's expression darkened. Because Edward Hayes and his associates would stop at nothing to seize control. 3 years ago, when I first discovered traces of petroleum in this region, I made the mistake of seeking investors openly. Within weeks, my test site was sabotaged, 3 good men died, and Hayes attempted to file claims on every surrounding parcel. The fire wasn't an accident. No. Bitterness edged his voice. Hayes couldn't allow a competitor to control such a resource, not when petroleum could eventually eclipse precious metals in value. His daughter Vivian was my confidant then, before I realized she reported everything to her father. The pieces aligned in Abigail's mind. That's why you ended your relationship with her, and why I needed to secure your aunt's property legally and irrefutably through marriage. The deed's unusual provision actually worked in my favor. Hayes couldn't challenge a legitimate marital transfer of property. Mason studied her thoughtfully. What I don't understand is why your aunt included that specific requirement. She knew, Abigail said softly, about petroleum. She discovered it decades ago, but chose to keep it secret. She believed it needed to be developed responsibly, not exploited ruthlessly. Yet she never developed it herself. The technology wasn't advanced enough then, and she was a woman alone who would have backed her. Abigail gestured toward his pumping equipment. Even now, you're operating in secret. Mason nodded. Until I secure the Silverton Company's backing. Their resources can protect this operation from Hayes and his allies. We signed the preliminary agreement yesterday. A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the steady drip of water into the petroleum pool. Abigail considered her position. Carefully. Mason had not threatened her, despite discovering her intrusion. Indeed, he seemed almost relieved to have the truth exposed between them. What happens now? She asked finally. That depends on you. Mason set down his lantern on a flat rock. Our arrangement has changed, hasn't it? You're not the desperate spinster seeking security that I expected, and I'm not merely the cold businessman you assumed me to be. No, Abigail agreed. We've both presented false faces. The question is whether we can build something genuine from those falsehoods. He took a step closer. I married you for your inheritance, Abigail. I won't pretend otherwise. But these past weeks, watching you transform my house, challenge my assumptions, pursue the truth with such determination, I've begun to wonder if our arrangement might become something more meaningful. Abigail felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. Despite everything, there was something compelling about Mason Blackwood. His drive, his intelligence, the flashes of vulnerability beneath his controlled exterior. I need to know your intentions. For this resource, she said, gesturing to the petroleum pool. My aunt protected it for decades because she believed it should benefit many, not enrich a few at the expense of the land and its people. What would you suggest? The question surprised her. There was no condescension in his tone, only genuine interest in her opinion. Develop it openly but responsibly, she replied after a moment's thought. Use some profits to improve conditions. In Silver Creek, better housing for miners, a proper school, a hospital. My aunt would have wanted that. Mason considered her words, his expression thoughtful. Your aunt sounds like a remarkable woman. She was, Abigail affirmed. She taught me that true value isn't always obvious at first glance. Their eyes met. Across the chamber, the implications of her statement hanging between them. The flickering lantern light softened Mason's features, revealing the man beneath the hard-driving businessman, younger, more vulnerable than he appeared in daylight. "Oh, we should return before the storm worsens," he said finally, breaking the moment. "There's much to discuss, and this isn't the place." They made their way back through the twisting passageways in silence, each absorbed in private thoughts. As they emerged from the cave entrance, fat raindrops had begun to fall, pattering against the pine needles and rocks. By unspoken agreement, they rode side by side down the mountain, the silence between them no longer tense, but contemplative. The storm gathered intensity, forcing them to seek shelter beneath a rocky overhang about halfway back to the property. "Will you tell me about her?" Mason asked suddenly as they watched the rainfall intensify. "Your aunt, the woman who recognized this resource decades before mining engineers." Abigail smiled, surprised by his interest. Margaret Foster defied every convention of her time. Never married, ran her own textile business, traveled alone when women simply didn't do such things. Pride warmed her voice. "She took me in after my parents died and taught me to be self-sufficient. Beauty fades," she would say, "but intelligence and determination only strengthen with time." "Wise advice," Mason commented. "Though in your case it appears you possess all three qualities." Abigail glanced at him, startled by the compliment. "I'm not skilled at expressing such things," he admitted, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "But our marriage began with deception. On both sides, perhaps honesty is the better path forward." "Yes," Abigail agreed softly, "though I'm not certain what forward means for us." Mason turned to face her directly. "I proposed a business arrangement to a woman I believed would be grateful for any marriage offer. Instead, I found myself husband to a beautiful, intelligent, remarkably stubborn woman who breaks into my study, rides unescorted up dangerous mountain trails, and challenges my every assumption." Despite everything, Abigail felt laughter bubble up. "Not quite what you bargained for." "No." A smile transformed his serious features. "Something far more valuable." The rain began to ease, sunlight breaking through the clouds to cast dappled patterns through the pine branches. As they prepared to continue their journey home, Mason hesitated, then offered his hand to help her mount. "I can't promise romance, Abigail," he said, his voice low and serious, "but I can offer partnership, genuine partnership in both business and life. Your insight regarding the responsible development of the petroleum reserve, it has merit. Perhaps together we could build something that honors your aunt's vision while securing our future." Abigail studied him for a long moment. The man before her was not the cold, calculating businessman who had married her for her inheritance, nor was he suddenly transformed into a romantic hero. He remained Mason Blackwood, driven, complex, sometimes harsh, but now revealed as someone capable of growth, of reconsideration, of respect. She placed her hand in his, feeling the strength and calluses earned through years of hard work. "Partnership," she agreed, "on equal terms." Something like hope flickered in Mason's dark eyes as he helped her into the saddle. As they rode toward Blackwood Manor, side by side in the rain-washed afternoon light, Abigail reflected on the strange journey that had brought her west. She had arrived veiled, concealing her beauty, expecting to be valued only for the property she brought to the marriage. Mason had married her believing he was getting a plain, desperate woman grateful for security, valued only for her inheritance. Both had presented false faces. Both had discovered unexpected truths. And perhaps, Abigail thought as they crested the final hill overlooking the valley, from those mutual deceptions might grow something genuine, a partnership founded not on appearances or property, but on shared vision and hard-won respect. The future, like the petroleum hidden beneath the whispering pines, held rich possibilities waiting to be discovered by those with courage enough to look beneath the surface. 3 months later, Silver Creek had begun a transformation few could have predicted. The announcement of the petroleum discovery, now officially named the Whispering Pines Reserve, had initially sent shockwaves through the mining community. Edward Hayes had made desperate legal challenges to the Blackwoods' claim, only to find himself outmaneuvered at every turn by the carefully documented chain of ownership and the ironclad marriage certificate. The Silverton Company's substantial investment had provided the capital needed to develop the resource properly. Under Abigail's insistence, a portion of the proceeds had been set aside for community improvements. Construction had already begun on a proper schoolhouse, and plans for a small hospital were being reviewed. Mrs. Blackwood, a moment of your time. Abigail looked up from the architectural drawings spread across the desk in what had once been Mason's private study, but now served as their shared office. Samuel Drummond stood in the doorway, hat in hand. "Of course, Mr. Drummond. Please come in." The foreman entered, nodding approvingly at the changes in the room. Bookshelves now housed both mining texts and volumes on textile production and business management. The curtains Abigail had sewn softened the morning light, and a second desk positioned near the window held her correspondence and design sketches. "The eastern shaft is producing better than expected," Drummond reported, "and the new safety measures are working well. Not a single injury this month." "Excellent news," Abigail replied. "And how are the men adapting to the petroleum operation?" "It's quite different from silver mining. Learning fast, ma'am. That training program you suggested, bringing in that specialist from Pennsylvania, was smart thinking." A noise from the doorway drew their attention. Mason stood there, his appearance subtly changed from the man who had greeted Abigail on her arrival months earlier. The perpetual tension in his shoulders had eased somewhat, and though still driven, he no longer looked like a man fighting exhaustion with sheer willpower. "Sam," he acknowledged with a nod. "I see you've brought the production reports to my wife before me." There was no accusation in his tone, merely wry observation. Drummond grinned. "Mrs. Blackwood asked specifically about the safety records. Figured you'd be more interested in the output numbers." Mason crossed to Abigail's desk, glancing at the architectural plans. "The hospital designs. What did Thompson say about the costs?" "They're higher than initially estimated," Abigail admitted, "but I've found ways to economize without compromising quality." She pointed to several modifications she'd marked. "And I've convinced 3 other business owners to contribute. Even Hayes has pledged a small sum." "Hayes?" Mason's eyebrows rose. "That's unexpected." "Vivian's influence, I believe," Abigail replied. "We've reached something of an understanding since she announced her engagement to that railroad investor from Denver." After Drummond departed, Mason lingered by Abigail's desk. "I've received a letter from Jenkins. He's handling the final paperwork for the new corporation structure." He hesitated. "Once completed, you'll officially own 30% of Blackwood." "Petroleum." Abigail looked up at him, surprised. "We agreed on 25. "So we did." Mason's expression remained neutral, though a warmth had entered his eyes that hadn't been there in their early days. "Consider the additional 5% recognition for your contributions to the operation's success." Their gazes held for a moment longer than necessary. The relationship that had begun as a cold business arrangement had evolved into something neither had anticipated. A genuine partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. They still maintained separate bedrooms, but dinners were no longer silent affairs. Conversations ranged from business strategies to literature, from childhood memories to future aspirations. The walls between them had begun to crumble, brick by careful brick. "Will you join me for dinner in town tonight?" Mason asked suddenly. Thompson mentioned the new restaurant by the hotel is surprisingly good. Are you asking me on an outing, Mr. Blackwood? Abigail teased, enjoying the faint colour that rose in his cheeks. I believe I am Mrs. Blackwood. Mason's usually stern mouth quirked upward. It occurs to me that we've never properly courted. An unusual sequence, Abigail agreed, to begin with marriage and proceed backward to courtship. We've never done things in the conventional order, have we? There was genuine warmth in his voice now. Perhaps it's time I properly court the woman I married. As they rode into town that evening, side by side rather than in the enclosed carriage, Abigail reflected on the extraordinary journey from their first meeting. The veil she had hidden behind, the cold businessman who had married her for property, the secrets and deceptions that had eventually given way to truth, all leading to this unexpected present and the promise it held. Silver Creek's citizens tipped their hats respectfully as they passed. No longer viewed as merely Blackwood's mail-order bride, Abigail had earned her own reputation for sharp business sense, community involvement, and the quiet strength that had transformed not only Blackwood Manor, but its owner as well. At the restaurant, Mason surprised her by pulling out her chair himself, rather than waiting for the server, a small gesture that spoke volumes about their changing relationship. I received a letter from Aunt Margaret's solicitor today, Abigail mentioned as they settled at their table. He found additional papers in her effects that he thought might interest us. Oh? Mason looked intrigued. More information about the petroleum reserve? Actually, no. It seems my aunt maintained a comprehensive journal of her business dealings over 40 years. Abigail smiled at the memory of her remarkable relative. He believes her methods could be compiled into a business manual that might be quite valuable, particularly for women seeking to establish themselves in commerce. You should publish it, Mason said immediately, with your own observations added. Between her textile experience and your insights on the petroleum business, it would be unprecedented. The genuine support in his voice touched Abigail deeply. This was what true partnership meant, not merely dividing profits or sharing decisions, but encouraging each other's growth and potential. As they walked back to their horses after dinner, Mason unexpectedly took her hand, his calloused fingers entwined with hers, tentative but deliberate. Abigail, he said, his voice low and serious, I know our beginning was unconventional. I married you for your inheritance, believing I was getting a desperate spinster grateful for any offer. He met her eyes directly. Instead, I found a partner who challenges me, improves me, and makes me see possibilities I never considered. And I married a cold businessman for financial security, Abigail responded softly, only to discover a complex, driven man with deeper principles than he cares to admit. The setting sun cast long shadows across Silver Creek's main street, gilding Mason's features as he studied her face. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, he leaned forward and brushed his lips against hers, their first kiss, tentative and questioning. When they separated, something had changed between them. A door opened that had previously remained firmly shut. Perhaps, Mason said as they mounted their horses for the ride home, we might consider a more conventional sleeping arrangement in the future, if you're amenable. Abigail felt warmth rise to her cheeks even as she smiled. I believe that might be arranged, Mr. Blackwood. As they rode toward home in the gathering twilight, Abigail thought about the strange twists of fate that had brought her west. She had arrived concealing her beauty, expecting to be valued only for her inheritance. He had married a woman he believed plain and desperate, valued only for her property. Both had presented false faces. Both had discovered unexpected truths, and from those mutual deceptions had grown something neither could have anticipated. A genuine partnership founded on respect, shared vision, and now the tender beginnings of love. The Whispering Pines had indeed yielded treasure, Not just the petroleum flowing from beneath the mountain, but the more precious discovery of two people who had found in each other something far more valuable than silver. Gold or oil, a partner who saw beneath the surface to the true worth within. 5 years passed, transforming both Silver Creek and the lives of Mason and Abigail Blackwood. The small mining settlement had blossomed into a prosperous town with paved streets, a respected school, and the finest small hospital in 3 counties. Blackwood Petroleum Company had expanded beyond Colorado, with operations now stretching into Wyoming and Utah. On a crisp autumn morning, Abigail stood on the wide porch of Blackwood Manor, watching her 3-year-old daughter Eleanor chase fallen leaves across the lawn. The child's dark hair and amber eyes reflected a perfect blend of her parents', though her stubborn determination was entirely her own. "She's got your spirit," came Mason's voice as he joined his wife, slipping an arm around her waist with the easy familiarity of years together. "And your focus," Abigail replied, smiling as Eleanor methodically gathered leaves into a careful pile. "Once she decides on something, nothing distracts her." Mason chuckled, the sound still rare enough to be precious. The hard-driving businessman remained, but time and family had softened his edges, revealing more often the thoughtful man beneath the stern exterior. "The board approved the new profit-sharing plan for employees," he said, his tone reflecting pride in what they'd built together. "Your presentation convinced even old Harrison, and he's been against it from the start." "It makes good business sense," Abigail replied. "Loyal workers who benefit from the company's success will ensure that success continues." They watched their daughter in comfortable silence for a moment before Mason spoke again. "I had a letter from Vivian Hayes, or rather Vivian Montgomery now. She and her railroad husband are opening a line through Denver to Cheyenne. Expanding their empire," Abigail noted without rancor. The bitter rivalry between the Blackwoods and the Hayes family had gradually transformed into a cautious business relationship after Edward Hayes's death 3 years earlier. Vivian, freed from her father's influence, had proven a surprisingly adept businesswoman in her own right. "She mentioned she's publishing her memoirs," Mason added with a hint of amusement. "I imagine we might feature in a chapter or 2. "No doubt, as the villains who thwarted her matrimonial ambitions," Abigail laughed, "though I suspect she's grateful for that particular failure now." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a carriage bearing Samuel Drummond, now general manager of Blackwood Petroleum's Colorado operations. The years had added silver to his hair, but hadn't diminished his steady competence. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood," he greeted them, tipping his hat. "Sorry to intrude on your Saturday, but those investors from Boston have arrived a day early. They're eager to see the original Whispering Pines site." Mason sighed. "I suppose it can't be helped. Give me a moment to change." "Actually," Abigail interjected, "I'll handle the tour. You promised Eleanor you'd take her riding this afternoon." She smiled at her husband's surprised expression. "I know the site as well as you do, and these Boston gentlemen might appreciate the historical perspective I can provide." Mason studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You're right, as usual." He turned to Drummond. "Mrs. Blackwood will conduct the tour. Please have James prepare her horse." After Mason departed to keep his promise to their daughter, Drummond commented, "Hard to believe this is the same man who once worked 20-hour days and barely spoke to his staff except to give orders." "People change when given reason to," Abigail replied, watching her husband swing a laughing Eleanor onto his shoulders. "Sometimes they just need someone to see their true potential." An hour later, Abigail led 3 impeccably dressed Boston investors along the now well-maintained trail to the Whispering Pines site. The original cave entrance had been expanded into a proper mining operation, though still modest compared to the larger facilities Blackwood Petroleum had established elsewhere. "Gentlemen," she announced as they reached the overlook, "this is where it began, the first petroleum discovery in Colorado territory." "And you were instrumental in this discovery, Mrs. Blackwood?" asked the eldest investor, clearly skeptical that a woman could have played any significant role. "My Aunt Margaret Foster actually made the initial discovery decades earlier," Abigail explained. "She recognized the value of petroleum before most mining experts, though the technology to extract it efficiently didn't exist then." She gestured toward the operation below. "What you see now represents our company's philosophy: sustainable extraction methods that preserve the surrounding landscape while providing jobs for over 100 local families." As Abigail continued her detailed explanation of the operation, answering complex questions with easy expertise, she caught the investors exchanging impressed glances. The notion that a woman, initially dismissed as merely Blackwood's wife, could demonstrate such thorough knowledge of the petroleum industry still surprised many. "I understand you've also published a quite successful business manual," mentioned the youngest investor as they prepared to return to town. Abigail nodded. "Based on my aunt's journals and my own experiences, it's been particularly well received among women seeking to establish themselves in commerce. The success of Beyond Appearances, A Woman's Guide to Business Success, had surprised even Mason, though he'd been her strongest advocate during its writing. Now, in its third printing, the book had brought Abigail recognition beyond her role. In Blackwood Petroleum, upon returning to Silver Creek, Abigail found the town bustling with preparation for the annual Founders' Day celebration. Shopkeepers hung banners, children practiced performances, and the town square had been transformed with festive decorations. She paused outside the Mercantile, now a proper department store managed by Theodore Pearson's daughter, to greet Sarah Parker, the widow of old Jim Parker, who had once guided Margaret Foster through the Whispering Pines. "The scholarship committee approved 5 new students for next term," Sarah reported proudly. As treasurer of the Margaret Foster Educational Fund, she helped administer the program Abigail had established to help promising young women pursue advanced studies. "Excellent news," Abigail replied. "I look forward to meeting them at the reception next week." As she continued toward home, Abigail reflected on how thoroughly intertwined her life had become with Silver Creek's. What had begun as a marriage of convenience, a business arrangement between strangers, had somehow expanded into a web of connections that enriched not only her family, but an entire community. That evening, after Eleanor had been tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Abigail found Mason in their shared study, reviewing correspondence by lamplight. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening in the way reserved only for her. "How did it go with the Boston contingent?" he asked, setting aside his papers. "They'll invest," Abigail replied confidently, settling into the chair across from him, though Mr. Harrington required some convincing that a woman could understand petroleum futures. Mason's mouth quirked into a half-smile. "Did you show him your quarterly projection charts? Those usually silence the doubters." "Eventually." She returned his smile. "Though I believe it was my detailed explanation of the new drilling technique that finally won him over." Mason rose and moved to the cabinet where they kept a small selection of fine spirits, pouring 2 glasses of brandy. He handed one to Abigail before taking a seat beside her on the leather settee they'd placed near the fireplace. "Do you ever wonder," he asked after a comfortable silence, "how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't been so deceptively veiled when you arrived? Or if I hadn't been so calculatingly determined to acquire your aunt's property?" Abigail considered the question seriously. "I might never have discovered the truth about the petroleum reserve. you might have continued, driving yourself to exhaustion over secrets and threats from competitors. She sipped her brandy thoughtfully. Or perhaps fate would have found another way to bring us to this same point, just by a different path. Fate. Mason mused, the concept still sitting somewhat uncomfortably with his practical nature. Or perhaps simply the inevitable result of two strong-willed people discovering they work better together than apart. A business partnership that became something more, Abigail agreed, her free hand finding his. Far more, Mason affirmed, his voice deepening. After 5 years of marriage, real marriage, not merely the legal arrangement they'd begun with, the connection between them had only strengthened. The initial respect had blossomed into deep affection, then love, creating a bond neither had anticipated. That day when a veiled woman had stepped from a stagecoach to meet a calculating businessman. From the nursery came a faint cry. Eleanor, likely awakened by a dream. Mason rose immediately. "I'll go. You've had a long day with those investors." Abigail watched him move toward their daughter's room with purpose and tenderness, two qualities that defined the man she'd come to know beneath the stern exterior he presented to the world. How far they had both come from their first meeting, when appearances and assumptions had shaped their expectations of each other. Later that night, as moonlight filtered through the curtains Abigail had sown during those first uncertain weeks, at Blackwood Manor, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her west. She had arrived concealing her beauty, expecting to be valued only for her inheritance. He had married, believing he was getting a plain, desperate woman, valued only for her property. Both had presented false faces. Both had discovered unexpected truths. And from those mutual deceptions had grown something that transformed not only their lives, but an entire community. A partnership founded on respect, vision and love that had uncovered values far more precious than silver, gold or oils. Mason's arm tightened around her in sleep. Abigail smiled at the simple truth they had both discovered. Sometimes the greatest treasures lie hidden beneath the surface, waiting for those with courage enough to look deeper, to discover the true worth that others might never see. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.